Welcome to LinkedUp, Breaking Boundaries in Education, a podcast that focuses on what is happening in education today, connecting everyone to the movers and shakers that are breaking boundaries in the education arena.
Welcome to LinkedUp, Breaking Boundaries in Education. This is Jamie Saponaro with Jerry Kimball, and today we're talking about the culture of a school and how it can really transform learning. It's not easily achieved to get to that situation but it really takes the involvement of the whole school community. Sometimes you can walk in a building and you can kind of sense that. Have you ever sensed that before, Jerry?
Oh my goodness, yes. As you visit buildings, the minute you walk in the door, you get a sense of what that school is all about. And there's some that I couldn't wait to get back in, and others I just didn't want to get out of the car.
Right. Oh, I know exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah. Yes. Well, today we have with us Hans Appel. And you know, the thing I think I love about you most, Hans, is that you are the counselor. And it just goes to show that leadership comes in all places in a school. And I love the fact that the school counselor has written the book and is kind of taking on this charge, because if the pandemic hasn't taught us anything, it has taught us that character really does count. It's that perseverance, that willingness to change. Those are the skills our kids are going to need. And so we're thrilled to have you here with us today. Hans is an author. You can see his book in the background, Award-Winning Culture, and he's here to talk to us about how you built that culture. But before we get started, Hans, I know there's a little bit of a backstory about your history and how you came to really believe in school culture and developing character when maybe other people were focused more on academics. Can you give us a little bit of your background and what brought you here?
Yeah, and this is awesome. Thank you so much for the introduction, and to be a part of this podcast is just amazing. So, yeah, first off, people always ask about my role or what I do, and I think my why really informs what I do. So I believe that education at its highest level is about inspiring others to discover and develop their joy. And growing up, I was your classic ACEs kid. Right? Child of divorce, abusive home, health issues. So I always tell people I could predict what kind of evening it was going to be with my dad based on how the back door slammed. There was a certain noise, right? A certain frequency. Survivors know exactly what I'm talking about. We're often able to take the temperature of the room, able to predict other people's behavior from subtle, indiscriminate signs that most people might completely overlook. So I knew when my dad got home each night how the evening was going to go based on how he walked through that door. And so at an early point for me, school really became my safe haven, right? It was my place I could go. I could be age appropriate. I didn't have to worry about solving complicated adult emotional issues. I could just be a kid. And so I think at an early point, big ideas like kindness and empathy and school culture really became foundational to me. Now, I guess the interesting part about my story is I met my wife, Jennifer, who is a fourth generation educator. And so we met at the tail end of high school. We went away to college together. And I think being surrounded in this, amazing family where it felt like an educator conference, every, family reunion or whatever, it was just everybody's story was about school. And so as I'm trying to figure out who am I, where do I fit in the world, what do I want to use my influence for, I think I just fell in love with the idea of working with kids. And so for the last 20 years, I've been a middle school counselor entirely at the middle school level. And it's fun because they're crazy, they're smelly, they're, like little kids and grown-up adults all in the same hour, right? You never know what you're going to get. It's a lot of fun. In addition to that, now I've had the opportunity, obviously, to write a book, which we'll talk about. And I'm the director of culture for the Teach Better team, which is an organization that really supports teachers all around the world now. Wonderful. But I guess the interesting, lead up to writing the book really started probably 10 years ago. We had what I would call a very reactive culture at the time. We were literally just sort of putting out fires. And there was one spring where we had kind of a number of situations where there had been a fight or an altercation, or, something had happened, and it was, principals and counselors that were there cleaning up the mess later, right after the fact. And we had this one situation in a science classroom where one student basically assaulted another student. And it was scary. And the student had to be restrained, and it was, it was really awful. So the principals and counselors were brought in basically to kind of deal with the aftermath, right? And so you're imagining this classroom full of kids that are traumatized, this teacher that's traumatized, and all of the worst things happen, right? The kid was suspended and eventually expelled. It was just an ugly thing. And so I spent the rest of that spring sitting in meetings trying to convince people that our school could be safe. And so the amount of reflection, the amount of, shame and guilt about our school not being what it could be was overwhelming, right? Trying to find words to comfort people and put people at ease and really believe that we were doing what's best was a lot. It was a really, really hard spring. But there was a couple things that I kind of realized in that time period. Number one, this wasn't a brand new teacher, right? This wasn't a situation where the teacher didn't have classroom management and didn't know what was happening. And, this was one of our veteran teachers that was really good. I think the other, point would be that this wasn't two students that hated each other and finally had enough. These were actually students that were best friends. Mm-hmm. And so despite all of that, the one student obviously didn't have the ability to regulate emotions. And so, arguing about a project led to this really horrible assault. And I think the last thing probably is what I've hung on to the hardest, since that situation is, despite all of the feelings that I had surrounding guilt and just like I didn't do enough to like support this student and, teaching social emotional learning and character ed and all this couldn't just be one person's job. Like
Absolutely.
the fate and all of what was resting as far as our community's mental health, right, which is our youth, it could not rest just on one individual. And so that was kind of the point where we sort of pivoted as a school and me certainly as a counselor and went, this has to become a school-wide thing. This has to become everybody buying in to an idea of infusing social emotional learning and character ed into everything that we do. Mm-hmm. So it can't just be on the school council, right? It's got to be the bus driver and the librarian and the custodian and the principal and the teachers and the parents and, our grocery store manager next door, and everybody has to be a part of it. And so that really prompted us to what I would say become proactive, where we started implementing curriculum and we started really kind of teaching to these specific topics. Now, I would say it was, multiple years later before we really got to a point of then taking it to the next level, which is what I write about in the book. And that's how do we now get intentional with these things?
Yes. And Hans, I have to really applaud your school for saying we need help, because so many times I think we have so much pressure from the public to be perfect. And so administrators and educators don't want to admit that we need any help. And so, taking that time to admit that and have those meetings, and it doesn't happen overnight, does it?
No, that's a great point. And, one of the things that I always tell schools when we work with schools to kind of work, help implement this work is that one of the key steps is time. And one of the things I always talk about is, we think in terms of implementation, maybe a curriculum or whatever we're doing, these adoptions, and we think of like year 1, year 2, year 3. I always tell school leaders, you need to think in terms of year 0, right? We need to think in terms of what happens the year before we really start this implementation process.
Absolutely.
So I think you're right. I think it definitely takes time.
Yes. And then it also, you have to get that buy-in from all of the stakeholders. So the teachers, that probably took some time, didn't it, to get them to buy in, or were they ready?
Yeah, I think it was in different phases. I think people knew it was time for change, right? Like, I think there's a feeling that things weren't the way that they could be or should be. I think it's a whole nother step to then go, okay, I want to be part of the solution, right? It's much easier to say, yeah, we have a problem here. Now somebody needs to fix it, than to say, oh, I'm going to be the one to help fix this. And really, I think what I talk about in the book is how do we get the entire community to buy into that idea, right? Where it's not just one or two or five individuals.
Yeah. And then when you talk about community, there's the parents.
Yep.
Was that a hard sell?
Well, yeah, I would say initially it definitely wasn't a hard sell that we needed to do some huge pivot, right? But yeah, I think the buy-in with parents is not probably, I don't know if it's as big as a lot of school leaders think it is. I think the importance is huge, but I think the hurdle isn't that large. I think if you were to ask most parents, academics probably come second. Most parents want to raise really great kids, bottom line. Like they want them to be good humans. They want them to be good citizens. Like most parents don't really care that much, what they decide to do with their life, as long as they're productive, healthy, happy individuals, right? And so I think, the sell of, supporting the whole learner or, infusing SEL character kinds of work, I think it's pretty easy with parents.
Right. I always find that teachers are so mired in everything that they have to do that it's hard for them to sometimes see that big picture, and the parents kind of see that big picture, and teachers, in their defense, they have so much that they are responsible for. So I understand how they feel that way. But really, the research that we've seen through the pandemic, parents are really saying that social emotional character is really what we want for our kids, which is great.
Yeah, and I think your point about it really being about the entire school community is so important, because it can't be just the counselor. It can't be just a handful of teachers or administration. It really has to have the involvement of the parents, of the school resource officers, everyone, the custodians. I mean, it really does come to everyone being involved. And I know that when you have schools reflect, you ask them, does your school culture have the power to evoke tears of joy? I've been in a building before where it does bring about those tears of joy, but it did take a transformation, just as you have described, with everyone being involved. What is the biggest trick for that? I mean, time is certainly a factor. Having character education, not just coming out from peer leadership groups and little here and there isolated, right, activities, but instead really embedding it into the curriculum. How do you go about doing that? What is your advice to schools to help that transformation?
Yeah. And I will say, you brought up the tears of joy. That's actually originated from a story, which maybe I'll share at the end of the podcast if we have time. So I'll tease that for later. But you're right. You can definitely feel it right away when you walk into a building. I think the research tells us that if we only focus on academics, we're only giving students 30 to 50% of what they need to be successful after high school. Right. So that means that if we do everything right, if they pass all the tests, hit all the standards, they do that for the entire time, all of their years in school, we failed them. Like that's it. Just let that marinate with you for a second. Like we've failed them if we do everything perfectly right as far as academics only, right? So the work is huge. So in my book, I basically break down, in the three big points being character, excellence, and community. So character being, will you do the right thing? Excellence being, will you do your very best? And community being, what will you do for others today? So these really have become our house rules, right? These are the things that drive everything else that we do in our school. And when I say everything else, I mean, like, it shows up in hiring practices, right? Like when we do interviews for new staff, it shows up in our morning announcements. It shows up in parent-teacher conferences. It shows up, in projects that we take on in the classroom level. Like every little like facet in our building kind of works and kind of funnels through those three questions.
So Hans, how does it show up in a parent-teacher conference?
So, yeah, I mean, like when you have, basically mom and dad sitting here and the teacher starts going through things, rather than just zeroing in and focusing on, okay, let's have a conversation about a grade or a particular test, we filter everything through those three questions. So in other words, like, what are the evidence that I've seen your kid doing the right thing? What are the evidence that I've seen, your child, do their very best in my math class? How has your child, been able to take care and support the entire learning community, right? And so those three things, I mean, certainly do we talk grades? Do we talk, assessment? All those kinds of things come up, but we do it within that framework. And so it makes those conversations so much more meaningful.
Oh, absolutely. Because we really, by the time they hit middle school, parents are kind of done with the conference because they have heard that so many times. But this would be interesting to hear how my student or how my child's doing the right thing and helping build community. I would think that would help bring more parents in.
And honestly, that's what they want that more, right? With all the online supports, right? They already know what the grade is. They already know, what the numbers say, but they want to know, I think parents show up to those kinds of experiences because they want the anecdotal. They want to hear a story about their kid. They want to know, is my kid heading the right direction, right?
You're so right. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely right. And it's not so much about how is my student doing, but how is my child doing, and what is their path to becoming a really good human? That's what it's all about. And that's what those three core guidelines that you are embedding into your culture is really about. And it really makes a big difference. And it's infused. And I think that's the difference here, because it's nothing in isolation. It is infused into your daily practice and everything in the content that is delivered, I'm sure, as you mentioned, parent conferences, with probably the minute you walk in the building, and even interviewing before they get into the building, for sure.
Oh, and understanding that this isn't just one more thing on their plate. This is really where everything evolves from.
Absolutely. Yeah. My friend, John Norland, I don't know if you guys know him. He works with Character Strong. He's got a saying that, he says this can't be just another thing on the plate. We have to help people understand that this is the plate, right? And this is the foundation for everything else. So I totally agree with you.
Yeah. You put a scoop of math on that plate, a scoop of everything else. But yeah, it is the foundation. You bet. So how has COVID and remote learning impacted your work? And can teachers still proceed with this during this remote learning time, or what have you seen?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. So pre-pandemic, the average student today has as much anxiety as the average psychiatric patient of the 1950s.
Oh
right?
my goodness.
So that means most kids that were walking around our campuses would have been hospitalized for how they're feeling on the inside. That's pre-pandemic, right?
Oh my gosh.
Since COVID, a huge study came out this summer and basically found exactly what you might think, right? Anxiety up, depression up, suicide risk up, access to mental health services way down. So we know that this is front and center.
Right.
Now, the interesting thing though is I don't know how you guys were. When this first hit for me, I only imagined that it was going to have negative impact on social emotional learning. The reality though is there's kind of two sides to this coin. There are the kids that have absolutely struggled with remote learning, right? And they are thrilled to be back. We're back in person now in our district and they love it, right? This is everything to them. there's the other kids though that really thrived during remote learning. And so there's lessons to be learned here, I think, for educators about, well, what's working for that group, right? Mm-hmm. Because now that we're back, we're having to try to still fit some of those remote pieces in to support what was so successful for that group of students. Right. So I really think it's almost twofold. But back to your original question of, can this work be replicated in a virtual setting? Absolutely. One company that we work with is PBIS Rewards. They do like positive behavior kinds of, incentive type things. One of the things that they've expanded on their app now is an SEL check-in, where teachers can, actually, give students a daily, kind of emotional temperature check as to how they're doing. And the really cool part about the technology now, there's a lot of folks that have been doing some version of that, but PBIS Rewards has taken it to another level where now they can match virtual interventions and supports that might, aid that kid in real time. So, let's say that Jerry is the teacher, I'm the student, I fill out, a 2-minute, check-in and say, man, it's a 1 for me today, Jerry. I'm not having a good day. Mm-hmm. I can now on my device get instantaneous things that might be tailored to me, right? So maybe I need, some sort of anger management, cool down space. Maybe I need, some breathing techniques. Maybe I need, a virtual reflection room, right? So we have the ability now, even in a virtual remote setting, to be able to, offer and deliver these real-time social emotional learning strategies to kids. So I think it's exciting to me, right? I think it's easy to get lost in the negativity of COVID and what all this has been, but I really think this is a time for education to pivot.
And I just have to say that really does work, because people say, oh, really? Can you give them some strategies virtually? And does that work? Because last week I heard that my bank account had been hacked. And I was a little panicked, right? And I had a friend that sent me some breathing techniques, and it just calmed me down. I couldn't believe it. And I thought, thank goodness for this friend that said, hey, let's take a minute here, Jerry. You're okay. It's going to be fine. And so those things do work. And you do appreciate when someone steps in and can say, this is what you need right now. And let's just breathe. So.
Well, and I'll follow up to that. I would say, the one thing with students that I see where it's not as successful or doesn't work is if it's not part of kind of everything else, right? If it just feels like this standalone thing, like, okay, I'm going to teach you how to breathe today, and then we're not going to use that ever again.
Right.
Then it's just phony, right? And at the elementary might do it for a little while, and then that sort of tailors off. But by middle school, high school, they're like, no, that's dumb, right? So I think, when we talk about these strategies, right, specifically, it has to be something that teachers are actually like modeling and practicing on a daily basis. Like it can't be this standalone Friday thing, let's never touch it again, right? And so I think that's huge for kids.
Yes, within context. I think that's why it worked for me. I was panicked and I needed it at the moment. So yeah, I think I'm with you totally. So
it's so important that authenticity is really the key, and making sure that it is embedded, not just like a quick morning meeting sort of thing, but something that is embedded throughout the day and part of everyday learning. You talk about in your book, the experiential problem-based events that kids can be a part of so that they feel valued, they feel empowered. I know you facilitate a student leadership podcast. Is that one example? What are some others? That sounds fantastic.
Yeah. So I'll tell you the backstory on that, because it's really fun. So a few years ago, my wife, who's the leadership teacher at our school, and I took a handful of students, maybe 3 or 4 hours across the mountains, right, to a statewide leadership conference. And it's a really cool event. They put it on each year. There's probably 5,000 or 6,000 kids from all over our state, and they bring in speakers and athletes and, authors and all kinds of just really amazing people. And it's just a day of inspiration, right? And so you get these amazing leadership kids all fired up and then go back and do great things in their school. So we're sitting there, and it's maybe 3/4 of the way through this, event. And we're listening to a 95-year-old Holocaust survivor named Nomi Bon. And she's, speaking in broken English, right? She's in a wheelchair. She's up on stage, and like you could literally hear a pin drop with like 5,000 or 6,000 students. Like you have, students sitting forward, like jaws dropped, like there's, educators around me that are in tears, right? You're hearing this emotionally moving story. And I kind of lean over to my wife who's sitting on my right, and I'm like, we've got to do this, and she gives me that look like, what are you talking about? Like, that husband wife thing, right? Yeah. And I'm like, we've got to do something like this. And so at the next break, we started talking about, well, what if we found a way to surround our kids with people like her, right? And people like him and people like, that person. Because the reality is we took a handful of students, not that many, over, across the mountains, but there was another 800 back at school that weren't able to experience this. And so slowly the idea became, well, maybe what we could do is create a platform where some of our students can have these kinds of conversations with amazing, inspiring people, and then share that, right? And so that was the early seeds. What it became is far exceeded my expectations. It's a student-led leadership podcast where, they bring in professional athletes or authors or speakers or whatever. They've even had other leadership students from, around the world on. And they have these like really in-depth conversations, right? Where they ask really intentional questions. Maybe it's a podcast all about anxiety, or maybe it's about self-harm, or maybe it's about, technology or parenting or school culture. Really, it could be just about anything. And then at the end, after the interview, the students do what we call a debrief, which is basically like a reflection, right? Where they kind of share what they learned and how they connect to, some of the things that were discussed. And then we share these out, right? And so it's been amazing to watch how, this is obviously just one example of experiential learning, but one way that you can literally impact your whole community in a positive way, just by, focusing on some big ideas that relate to school culture.
And I suspect they took ownership of the learning, and that's why they have amazed you.
Oh, it's incredible. Like
exceeded your expectations when they take on.
Oh, yeah. You have no idea. Like they've had so many amazing opportunities. Like they've been, guest appearances on other people's shows, right? Like they've been recognized by a state superintendent. They actually did a presentation to a group of curriculum directors in the Midwest. They had to get to school at 6 a.m. and they did a full hour presentation, not me, not my wife, like the kids. And basically what they had learned, how they put it together, how they, all the ins and outs of doing one of these podcasts. Like it's amazing. It's like really amazing to watch kids, own their own learning, right?
Right. And they take it beyond anything we could have dreamed of.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's basically like, here are the tools, and then you kind of just like step back and just watch it flourish. I mean, it's quite impressive. And so I guess you have a lot of these types of projects that go on, so that way they are still being able to account for each of the different foundational leads that you have in your school. So that way they are really able to it's embedded, right? And not in isolation. It's project-based. It's providing for the community and allowing them to grow in different ways because it's theirs. There's ownership that way.
Yeah. And it's fascinating because, you like, I've heard from parents that say, I can't get my own kid to open up to me, but I'll listen to this podcast because now I can understand, the way a 12, 13, 14-year-old thinks about, social media, or, when's the best, time and place to be able to talk to my kid. Just like little things like that, where it's like, okay, now there's other people that are really having this, learning experience, far beyond what we had originally envisioned. It's just so cool.
What is the name of the podcast?
So it's called Award-Winning Culture. Yep. Hosted by Wildcat Nation. So.
Oh, perfect.
All right, good.
Great.
Yep.
We're going to listen in.
Hans, I have a question for you to kind of land this plane, if you will. I had a mentor one time that would always ask me this, and I loved this question. What has become clear through all of this work? What has become clear to you?
It's a wonderful question. I would say the thing that has become the most clear is how important this work is. Mm-hmm. And when you ask that question, I'm kind of thinking like really present tense, like currently. Like yes. I'm going to be honest with you. I'm a school counselor. I've known this work matters forever. Sure. But I feel like the world now has caught up and like really understands that we have to be supporting the whole learner, right? And I think this has become my experience in working with districts, especially in the last year or so, 10 months maybe, has been that people really get that now. So I feel like there used to be a lot of work about really understanding the why. Right. I think people now, I think they get the why. Like I hope, right? But I think what's become clear is now it's time to go beyond that. Now people are reaching out to my wife and I going, okay, I'm on board. Now what? What's the first step? Where do I go from here? Right. And that's exciting to me because now we can do the real work.
You bet.
It's one of those silver linings that we talk about that's coming out of the pandemic. There's clarity in what our priorities need to be. And this is absolutely one of them. So schools that have already been through the process and doing it, they probably feel like this is a good thing. We're in this place. And then others are realizing we have work to do. There has been this time of reflection and there's work to do. So, it's fantastic that they're able to see that and, moving forward with what needs to happen with the award-winning culture.
Hans, does your book kind of help schools get started with this? Could they use it as a framework to get started or?
Yeah, 1,000%. I appreciate you saying that. So the book really is a school-wide framework, and it breaks down basically how we went from being a school of fistfights to winning all kinds of awards for our school culture now. So it really, I think, hopefully articulates how school leaders can really create this work. The really cool thing, which I'll tease to you guys, is my wife, Jennifer, is writing the sequel to this book, and that should be out late this spring. And it's entirely geared towards the classroom, right? So it's, okay, how do we take this big picture idea and how do we actually do that in our own like teacher space? So I'm really excited about that. She's got some really, I can't say too much about it, but it's pretty special as far as really moving way beyond just curriculum and thinking in terms of how do we infuse this into everything that happens within the classroom? Yeah. So that's going to be really cool. You are a
special team. My goodness.
Absolutely.
That's great. That's great. So as we finish out here today, how can people find you, find your book? Are you on social media? I see it on your back wall. Tell us, how do we get in touch with you?
Yeah. So the best place probably to get us would be on our website, which is awardwinningculture.com. So really simple. We have a podcast as well of our own that's all about school culture called Award-Winning Culture. And then all of our speaking information and coaching, we have courses on there. So we would love to have, people checking that stuff out. The other great way to connect with me would be on Twitter or Instagram. And my handle is Hans N. Appel, and you spell Apple weird. It's Appel. But I love connecting with people. Growing my PLN has been huge to my own development and growth. So I love connecting with people on Twitter and Instagram for sure.
And I want to purchase the book today for my daughter that's a school counselor. Where do I go?
Yeah, so you can get the book on Amazon or Barnes & Noble. I think it's at Target too. And then it's also on our website if you want to get an autographed copy.
Oh, well, of course. That's what we want. Absolutely. Well, thank you so much. This has been so eye-opening, and I love the way that you are modeling for other schools, and you have put it into a book that they can read and use as a framework. They can't copy and replicate everything you've done, but they can sure take that framework and make it work for their culture as well. Appreciate the work that you're doing for kids. And, you have to be a special person. I think, Jamie, you and I were both middle school.
Right.
People.
Oh,
so,
yeah.
These are our peeps. We're just a little different than your normal person, right?
It is the truth. Yeah, we really do appreciate your work. This is really exciting. And I think your book sounds like the perfect framework for people to get started. It sounds like everything is set in stone as a perfect framework for launching forward. And this is the time to do it, for sure.
Absolutely. Thank you for your dedication and your service that you're giving and sharing with others.
Thank you for listening. And if you would like to stay linked up, be sure to follow us on Apple and Spotify and subscribe to us on YouTube.